arrangement to satisfy her own curiosity. And do not deflect. You bought the right to my time. I am spending it however I choose. Sebastian looked startled for a moment, and then he laughed, a genuine sound of surprised pleasure that transformed his usually severe features into something almost boyish. "You are not what I expected, Miss Fairfax," he said. "Most women would not dare be so direct. Most women have not had their dance cards purchased for an entire season." She countered. "I think unusual circumstances permit unusual behavior." "Fair enough," he conceded, and his expression grew more serious as he guided her through a turn. "My father married my mother for her fortune. She was the daughter of a wealthy merchant, not quite accepted by the aristocracy but desperate to be, and my father needed money to restore the Ashford estates. He was unfailingly polite to her, never raised his voice or his hand, but he treated her with such cold indifference that it was worse than cruelty might have been. I watched her smile fade year by year, watched her become smaller and quieter until she was barely a shadow of the vibrant woman I remembered from my early childhood. When she died, I swore I would never trap another woman in such a marriage." Georgiana felt her throat tighten with sympathy at the raw pain in his voice, the way his jaw clenched as he spoke of memories that clearly still haunted him. "And yet you have caged yourself instead," she said softly. "Is that truly better?" Sebastian's eyes met hers with such intensity that she felt the impact physically. "I am beginning to wonder," he admitted. The honesty of his response made her heart race, and she found herself sharing her own wound in return, the words spilling out before she could reconsider. "My mother died when I was 10. An influenza epidemic swept through London, and she insisted on personally tending the sick on our estate, rather than leaving it to servants. She always said privilege carried responsibility. She caught the illness and was gone within a week. My father fell apart. He could not bear to be in our country house where everything reminded him of her, so we moved to London, and he threw himself into business ventures, investments, anything to distract himself from his grief. He made increasingly reckless choices, and when the railway schemes failed, he lost almost everything." Sebastian's hand tightened on hers. "I am sorry," he said simply. "You must have felt very alone." "I did," she admitted. "I still do, most of the time." Until now, the words were out before she could stop them. Too honest, too revealing, and she felt her cheeks flush with embarrassment. "Until now," Sebastian repeated quietly, and there was something in his voice that made her look up to find him watching her with an expression she could not quite decipher, but that made her pulse quicken. "We are both trying not to repeat our parents' mistakes," she observed, grateful for the distraction of analysis. "You by avoiding marriage entirely, me by being willing to accept a loveless match for financial security. Perhaps we are more alike than either of us realized." "Perhaps," Sebastian agreed, his thumb tracing small circles on the back of her hand where he held it, a gesture she was not certain he was even aware of making. "Or perhaps we are learning that the patterns we thought were inevitable can actually be changed if we have the courage to try something different." The dance ended, but Sebastian did not immediately release her hand, and they stood for a moment in the middle of the floor while other couples moved around them, caught in a bubble of awareness that made the crowded ballroom feel suddenly intimate. Then he seemed to recall where they were and stepped back with a slight bow, but his eyes never left her face as he asked if she would like refreshment or preferred to continue dancing. "I should like to dance," she said, surprising herself with how much she meant it. "I have not enjoyed a ball since, I cannot remember when." The evening passed in a blur of waltzes and reels and polkas, Sebastian claiming every dance with the proprietary confidence of a man who had literally purchased the right to do so, and Georgiana found herself relaxing into the rhythm of it, the pleasure of moving with a partner who anticipated her every step, the unexpected joy of conversation that ranged from light teasing to deeper revelations about their lives and thoughts. She noticed other women watching them with undisguised envy, their eyes following Sebastian with the hunger of those who had pursued him for years without success, and she felt a forbidden pleasure at being the one on his arm, the one he smiled at with genuine warmth rather than polite distance. During a brief interval when Sebastian went to procure champagne, Lady Caroline materialized at Georgiana's side with eyes bright with curiosity. "My dear, you must tell me everything," she said in an urgent whisper. "The entire ballroom is talking about nothing but you and the Duke. Is it true he paid your father £50,000 merely for the right to dance with you?" Georgiana felt her cheeks warm. "I would prefer not to discuss the financial details, but yes, we have an arrangement for the season." Lady Caroline's expression softened. "And are you happy with this arrangement?" Georgiana considered the question, glancing across the room to where Sebastian stood speaking with the Duke of Somerset, his tall figure commanding attention even in a crowd of distinguished men. To her surprise, "I think I am," she said quietly. "Or at least, I am happier than I would have been accepting Lord Whitmore's suit." "That much is certain," Lady Caroline agreed with feeling. "Whitmore has been poisoning every ear he can find with suggestions that you and Ashford are engaged in something scandalous. But I notice you are smiling more tonight than I have seen in months, so I think perhaps the scandal is worth it." Sebastian returned with champagne, and Lady Caroline excused herself with a meaningful look, and as Georgiana sipped the cool sparkling wine, she felt some of her remaining tension dissolve. The ballroom had grown warmer as the evening progressed, the combined heat of hundreds of bodies and thousands of candles, making the air thick and fragrant with mingled perfumes and the scent of hothouse flowers that filled every available surface. Through the tall windows she could see the formal gardens lit by lanterns, and beyond them the full moon rising over the estate, casting silver light across the manicured lawns. They danced again and again, and somewhere during their 7th or 8th turn around the floor, Georgiana realized that she had stopped counting the dances, stopped worrying about the watching crowd, stopped thinking about anything except the man guiding her through the steps with such focused attention that she felt like the only woman in the world. "Thank you, Your Grace," she said, as the orchestra began what she knew would be the final waltz of the evening. "I have not enjoyed myself this much in longer than I can remember." "Sebastian," he corrected gently. "When we are dancing, call me Sebastian." The intimacy of using his given name made her breath catch, but she tried it tentatively. "Sebastian." His eyes darkened at the sound of his name on her lips, and his hand tightened at her waist. "Yes," he said, his voice rougher than usual. "Just like that." They danced the final waltz in silence, but it was a comfortable quiet, weighted with awareness and the sense of something shifting between them, some barrier beginning to crack. When the music ended, and Sebastian finally, reluctantly released her, Georgiana felt the loss of his touch like a physical ache. The crowd began to disperse, guests calling for their carriages, the spell of the evening beginning to break, and Sebastian offered his arm to escort her out into the soft summer night. A light rain had begun to fall, while they were inside, barely more than mist, and the air smelled clean and fresh after the oppressive heat of the ballroom. They waited under the portico for his carriage to be brought round, and Georgiana was acutely aware of his presence beside her, the solid warmth of him, the way he angled his body slightly to shield her from the damp breeze. "I meant what I said earlier," Sebastian told her quietly. "I am the luckiest man in London, not because of my title or fortune, but because I get to spend my evenings dancing with you." Georgiana looked up at him, this complicated man who had charged into her life with an outrageous proposal and somehow given her the first genuine happiness she had felt in years. "I think perhaps we are both lucky," she said softly, "to have found each other, even under such unusual circumstances. His carriage arrived, and he handed her up with careful courtesy, settling beside her for the short ride back to her father's house. And as they rolled through the rain-slicked streets of London, Georgiana felt something warm unfurling in her chest, something that might have been hope, or might have been the first tentative stirrings of an emotion she was not quite ready to name. Sebastian walked her to her door, and in the shadowed privacy of the entrance, he took her hand and raised it to his lips, his eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her pulse race. "Sleep well, Georgiana," he said, and the sound of her name in his deep voice sent shivers down her spine. "I shall call tomorrow to discuss our next engagement." She watched from the window of her room as his carriage disappeared into the misty night, and when she finally turned away, she caught sight of her reflection in the looking-glass and was startled by what she saw. The woman staring back at her was flushed and bright-eyed, her lips curved in a smile she had not consciously put there, and she looked alive in a way she had not looked in years, as though something that had been dormant within her had suddenly awakened. Across London in his Mayfair townhouse, Sebastian dismissed his valet and stood at the window of his study, staring out at the rain without really seeing it, his mind full of amber eyes and spontaneous laughter, and the way Georgiana had felt in his arms as they danced, so perfectly matched to his movements that it was as though they had been dancing together for years rather than hours. He had told himself this arrangement was about giving her choice, about preventing her from being trapped as his mother had been trapped, and those things were true. But he was beginning to suspect there was another truth beneath the noble justification, that from the moment he had seen her across Lady Hertford's ballroom, with resignation in her eyes and grace in her bearing, despite the humiliation she was enduring, something in him had recognized something in her, a kindred spirit, a fellow survivor of parents' mistakes, someone who might understand the walls he had built, and why he had built them. He poured himself a brandy he had no intention of drinking, and acknowledged what he had been trying to ignore since signing those papers in Lord Fairfax's study, that the arrangement he had presented as temporary and practical was already becoming something else entirely, something dangerous and wonderful and terrifying, and that 3 months might not be nearly enough time to satisfy the hunger he felt building in his chest every time Georgiana smiled at him. The rain intensified, drumming against the windows in a rhythm that matched his racing thoughts, and Sebastian stood alone in his study and wondered what madness had possessed him to think he could spend an entire season in Georgiana Fairfax's company without falling completely and irrevocably in love with her, and whether perhaps that had been his intention all along, hidden even from himself until it was too late to retreat. In her bedchamber, Georgiana lay awake and stared at the ceiling, reliving every moment of the evening, every word exchanged, every touch of Sebastian's hand on hers, and she tried to tell herself that the warmth spreading through her chest was simply gratitude for being rescued from Edmund's presumptuous suit. But she knew she was lying to herself, knew that what she felt when she looked into Sebastian's grey eyes and saw them soften as he watched her laugh was something far more dangerous than gratitude, something she had promised herself she would not allow because their arrangement had an expiration date and she could not afford to lose her heart to a man who had made it clear he had no intention of marrying anyone. But as sleep finally claimed her, and her dreams filled with the memory of strong arms guiding her through a waltz and a deep voice calling her beautiful, Georgiana had to admit that it might already be too late for such sensible precautions, that the walls around her own heart were crumbling just as surely as Sebastian's were, and that whatever happened at the end of the season, she was already far more invested in this arrangement than simple self-preservation would recommend. The 3 weeks following the Duchess of Somerset's ball had passed in a blur of social engagements and stolen conversations, and Georgiana had discovered that happiness was not the quiet contentment she had always imagined, but rather a bright fizzing sensation that made her feel perpetually breathless, as though she were standing on the edge of something vast and wonderful and terrifying all at once. Sebastian called for her nearly every evening, their routine now familiar to the point of comfort, his carriage arriving promptly at the appointed hour, his hand steady as he helped her ascend, the way his eyes would find hers across crowded ballrooms, with a look that made her pulse race no matter how many times she saw it. They had danced at Lady Pembroke's musicale and the Earl of Devonshire's ball and countless other gatherings where London society watched, their every interaction with fascination that ranged from romantic approval to scandalized disapproval. But Georgiana found she cared less and less what others thought as she grew more certain of what she herself felt, which was that Sebastian Wentworth had somehow become the most important person in her world, and the thought of the season ending and their arrangement dissolving filled her with a dread she tried desperately not to examine too closely. They talked during their dances, really talked in a way Georgiana had never experienced with another person, Sebastian sharing stories of his childhood at the Ashford estate and his years in India with the army, though she noticed he always stopped short of discussing why he had left military service, a shadow crossing his face whenever the topic approached that particular territory. She in turn told him about her mother's charity work and her own love of reading and the dreams she had harbored as a girl of traveling to Italy and Greece, dreams sometimes that had seemed impossibly distant when her only future appeared to be marriage to Edmund Whitmore, but that now felt tantalizingly possible again, as though Sebastian's intervention had opened doors she had thought permanently closed. London society remained divided on the propriety of their arrangement, the older matrons generally disapproving while younger people found it thrillingly romantic, and the gossip columns had taken to calling them the Duke and his dancing partner, with a mixture of amusement and speculation about whether the season would end in marriage or scandal. Edmund Whitmore had withdrawn from society after his humiliation, at least that was what Georgiana had heard from Lady Caroline, and she had felt only relief at not having to face his cold fury across crowded rooms, though sometimes she caught herself wondering if his absence was merely the calm before a storm. The Marquis of Blackwood's garden party arrived on a perfect June afternoon, the kind of day that seemed designed for pleasure, with cloudless blue skies and a gentle breeze carrying the scent of roses and freshly cut grass across the expansive lawns that sloped down toward the Thames. The estate in Richmond was one of the loveliest in England, its formal gardens giving way to natural parkland where deer grazed beneath ancient oaks and white pavilions had been erected on the lawn to provide shade for the 200 guests who had been invited to what promised to be the social event of the week. Georgiana wore a new dress of pale pink muslin with delicate embroidery at the hem and sleeves, and when Sebastian called for her that afternoon, his eyes had darkened with appreciation in a way that made her feel beautiful and desired in ways she had never experienced before. The party was well underway when they arrived, ladies with parasols strolling along the garden paths, while gentlemen engaged in lawn bowling and archery, refreshment tables laden with iced champagne and delicate pastries, the whole scene one of elegant leisure that represented English society at its most refined. Sebastian secured them glasses of champagne, and they wandered toward the river, where the willow trees provided dappled shade, and the sound of water over stones created a peaceful backdrop, and Georgiana felt herself relaxing into the afternoon with the easy contentment that had become familiar whenever she was in Sebastian's company. They were standing near one of the refreshment pavilions, laughing over something Sebastian had said about the Duchess of Marlborough's truly spectacular hat, when Georgiana noticed a commotion near the main lawn, voices rising in a way that suggested something more dramatic than the usual polite garden party conversation. Sebastian noticed it too, his expression shifting from relaxed amusement to wary attention, and then the crowd seemed to part, and Edmund Whitmore strode through, his face set with grim determination and a leather portfolio clutched in his hand. Georgiana felt her stomach drop, some instinct warning her that whatever was about to happen would shatter the fragile happiness of the past 3 weeks, and she moved closer to Sebastian without conscious thought, seeking the protection of his presence even as she watched Edmund approach with the focused intensity of a man on a mission. "Ladies and gentlemen," Edmund announced loudly, his voice carrying across the lawn and causing conversations to halt mid-sentence as heads turned toward him with the avid curiosity of those who sensed impending scandal. I apologize for interrupting these pleasant festivities, but I have information of such importance regarding one of our company that I felt duty-bound to share it immediately in the interest of protecting the innocent from harm. Sebastian had gone very still beside her, his expression shifting from wary to blank in the space of a heartbeat, and Georgiana felt cold dread spreading through her chest as Edmund's eyes found hers with something that might have been concern or might have been triumph. She could not tell which. "I have here letters," Edmund continued, raising the portfolio for all to see. "Correspondence from Sebastian Wentworth's time serving in India with the military, which detail a most disturbing scandal involving the wife of his superior officer." He opened the portfolio with theatrical precision and withdrew several sheets of paper, his voice taking on the cadence of a prosecutor as he began to read. Lieutenant Sebastian Wentworth was observed multiple times in the company of Mrs. Catherine Whitley, wife of Colonel James Whitley, in circumstances most compromising to her reputation and his honor. The gasps that rippled through the assembled guests seemed to suck all the air from the garden, and Georgiana stared at Edmund in horrified disbelief as he continued reading, his voice growing stronger with each damning phrase. The colonel's subsequent despair at his wife's infidelity and Lieutenant Wentworth's betrayal of his trust led to tragic consequences, culminating in Colonel Whitley's death by his own hand and Lieutenant Wentworth's hasty resignation from military service. A resignation which speaks eloquently to his guilt in this sordid affair. Georgiana turned to look at Sebastian, desperate for him to deny the accusations, to explain, to do something other than stand there with his face drained of color and his jaw clenched so tight she could see the muscle jumping beneath his skin. But he said nothing, made no move to defend himself, and his silence seemed to confirm every terrible thing Edmund had just implied. "The Duke of Ashford is no honorable gentleman," Edmund declared, his eyes burning with righteous fury as he addressed Georgiana directly. "He destroys lives and walks away, leaving ruin in his wake. Miss Fairfax, I am trying to save you from making a terrible mistake. This man will destroy you as he has destroyed everyone who has trusted him, just as he destroyed Colonel Whitley and left his widow to face scandal and shame alone." The crowd erupted into shocked whispers, fans fluttering with agitation as ladies pressed closer to hear better, and gentlemen exchanged meaningful glances that suggested they had suspected something of this nature all along. Georgiana felt the world tilting around her, the beautiful garden suddenly oppressive, the faces of people she had known for years twisted with judgment and speculation, and through it all, Sebastian remained silent, his expression carefully blank in a way that made him look guilty, made him look like exactly the kind of man Edmund was describing. "This is the man who has bought your company for the season," Edmund continued, his voice softening with what seemed like genuine concern. "A man who cannot commit to anything or anyone without destroying it. I beg you to reconsider your arrangement before he ruins you as thoroughly as he has ruined everyone else who made the mistake of trusting him." Georgiana could not breathe, could not think, the weight of hundreds of eyes upon her as she stood frozen beside a man she had thought she was beginning to know, beginning to love, only to discover that perhaps she knew nothing at all. She looked at Sebastian again, willing him to speak, to explain, to give her any reason to disbelieve what Edmund had just revealed. But he only met her gaze with something that looked heartbreakingly like resignation, as though he had been expecting this moment and had already accepted its inevitability. "I need," she started, her voice barely audible over the rising buzz of speculation. "I need a moment, please." She turned and fled before anyone could stop her, gathering her skirts and running across the lawn toward the river. Her vision blurring with tears, she refused to let fall until she was away from the crowd, away from the judgment and the whispers and the terrible expression on Sebastian's face that had looked like guilt and shame and defeat all tangled together. She found herself in a small grove of willow trees near the water's edge, the long branches hanging low to create a natural curtain that provided blessed privacy, and she collapsed onto a stone bench and finally let herself cry. Great shaking sobs that came from somewhere deep in her chest, where hope had been building for 3 weeks only to be shattered in the space of 5 minutes. The sound of footsteps on grass made her look up, and Sebastian stood at the edge of the grove, his face still that terrible mask of blank composure that revealed nothing, and somehow revealed everything. "Georgiana," he said quietly, "please let me explain." She stood, anger rising to replace the grief, because anger was easier, safer than acknowledging the pain of betrayal. "Explain what?" she demanded, her voice shaking. "Explain that everything Edmund said is true. That you seduced a married woman and drove her husband to suicide. That you fled India rather than face the consequences of your actions. Your silence back there was explanation enough." Sebastian flinched as though she had struck him. "It is not that simple," he said, his voice rough with emotion he was clearly struggling to contain. "The truth is far more complicated than Whitmore's version, but I cannot defend myself without making things worse, without hurting someone who has already suffered more than anyone should have to bear." "Then tell me," Georgiana said desperately. "Tell me the truth, all of it, not the version that protects me, but the real truth. Because right now I do not know what to believe or who to trust, or whether the past 3 weeks have been built on lies." Sebastian moved closer, his hands clenched at his sides as though he did not trust himself to reach for her. "Colonel James Whitley was my commanding officer in India," he began, each word seeming to cost him. "He was well respected, connected to powerful families, everything a military man should be. But he was also a monster who beat his wife behind closed doors, who used his rank and position to ensure no one questioned him." When she appeared with bruises, she explained away as clumsiness. His voice cracked slightly, and he paused to gather himself before continuing. "I discovered the truth by accident, came upon him striking her in their quarters when I arrived early for a meeting. I reported it to my superiors, believing they would take action, but they covered it up, said that marital matters were private and that Whitley's service record was too valuable to risk over domestic discord." Georgiana felt her anger wavering as she watched the pain in his eyes, the way his hands trembled slightly as he spoke. "What happened then?" she asked more gently. "I could not serve under a man I knew to be an abuser, could not stand by while the system protected him and condemned her to continued suffering." Sebastian said, "I told Mrs. Whitley that I would help her leave if she wished it, that I had family connections who could provide her safe refuge. We met several times to discuss arrangements, always in public places, but not public enough, apparently, because rumors started. Someone saw us talking in the regimental gardens, saw me hand her a letter containing information about where she could go, and they assumed the worst." He turned away, staring at the river as though he could not bear to meet her eyes. Colonel Whitley heard the rumors and confronted his wife. She told him she was leaving, that she could not endure his cruelty any longer. That night he took his own life, and the next morning the official inquiry began. They had those letters Edmund read today, evidence of my meetings with Mrs. Whitley, and they were preparing to court-martial me for conduct unbecoming an officer. But Mrs. Whitley came to me before the inquiry could proceed. She was devastated, blaming herself for her husband's death, and she begged me not to defend myself by revealing what he had done to her. She said she could not bear to have her private shame made public, that society would blame her anyway, and that if I truly wanted to help her, the best thing I could do was resign quietly and let the scandal die. So I did. Sebastian turned back to face Georgiana, his expression raw with emotions he no longer tried to hide. I resigned my commission and left India, and the inquiry was quietly buried because neither side wanted the truth to come out. Mrs. Whitley was able to return to England and eventually remarried to a good man who treats her with the kindness she deserves. She has found happiness and peace, and I will not destroy that by defending myself now, Let them think what they will of me, but I will not drag her through scandal again." Georgiana felt tears streaming down her face as she listened, understanding now the impossible position he had been in, the choice between his own honor and protecting a woman who had already suffered so much. "I believe you," she whispered. "But they will not, will they? The Ton will believe Edmund's version because it is simpler, more scandalous, and because you will not defend yourself." Sebastian moved closer, his hand reaching out as though to touch her face before dropping back to his side. "I knew this would surface eventually," he said, his voice heavy with resignation. "I should never have dragged you into my life. You were right to be suspicious of my motives, right to question why I made that offer. Perhaps I was selfish. Perhaps I wanted something for myself even knowing it could not last." His grey eyes held hers with devastating honesty. "You are free of our arrangement, Georgiana. Go. Save yourself. Walk away before my scandal destroys your reputation entirely." She stared at him, seeing in his face the same look her mother must have worn when she chose to tend the sick, knowing it might cost her life, the look of someone willing to sacrifice themselves for another's well-being. "And if I do not want to be saved?" she asked, her voice barely audible over the sound of the river. "If I want to stay." Sebastian's expression crumbled for just a moment before he forced it back to careful control. "Do not," he said desperately. "Do not sacrifice your future for me. I am not worth it." "Should I not be the judge of that?" Georgiana challenged, anger rising again, but this time directed at his self-recrimination rather than at him. "You have spent 3 weeks telling me I have the right to choose my own path, to make my own decisions. Do not take that away from me now by deciding what I can and cannot risk." "But this is different," Sebastian argued. "This is not about whether you prefer Whitmore or another suitor. This is about whether you are willing to be branded as the mistress of a man accused of driving another to suicide, to have your name connected to scandal that will follow you for the rest of your life." "Yes," Georgiana said quietly. "It is about exactly that. And it is my choice to make, not yours." They stood facing each other in the dappled shade of the willow grove, the sound of the garden party continuing in the distance, laughter and music carrying on as though the world had not just shifted irrevocably. Georgiana could hear the whispers that would already be spreading through the crowd, the speculation about where she and Sebastian had disappeared to, the assumptions that Edmund's revelations would be taken as confirmed truth by her failure to immediately denounce Sebastian and return to the party on Edmund's arm. "If I stand by you," she said slowly, thinking through the implications, "I will be ruined by association. The Ton will assume the worst, will say I am either your mistress or a fool, and no respectable man will want me after this season ends." Sebastian's face was anguished. "Yes," he confirmed, "that is exactly what will happen. And if I walk away, return to the party and accept Edmund's suit, I salvage my reputation and secure my father's financial future," Georgiana continued. "I would be safe, respectable, everything I was raised to be." Sebastian nodded, his throat working as he swallowed hard. "I would not blame you," he said hoarsely. "I would understand completely." Georgiana looked at him, this complicated man who had charged into her life with an outrageous proposal and somehow given her 3 weeks of genuine happiness, who had shared his deepest wounds with her and listened to hers in return, who had made her laugh and made her feel seen in ways she had never experienced before. She thought of Edmund's cold triumph as he read those letters, the way he had framed his revelation as concern for her well-being when it was clearly motivated by wounded pride and jealousy, and she realized that whatever Sebastian's flaws, whatever mistakes he had made, his fundamental character was decent in a way Edmund's would never be. But then she thought of her father, already counting on the settlement Sebastian had paid, the relief in Lord Fairfax's eyes when he believed their financial troubles were over, and she thought of the Vicious whispers that would follow her if she chose to stay, the doors that would close, the future that would narrow to almost nothing. "I need time," she said finally. "I need to think, to understand what I am choosing and what it will cost." Sebastian nodded, his expression shuttered again. "Of course," he said formally. "I will escort you home, and you may send word when you have made your decision." They walked back through the gardens in silence, and Georgiana was acutely aware of the eyes following them, the whispers that died when they passed only to resume with renewed vigor behind their backs. Edmund stood near the main pavilion, surrounded by a knot of sympathetic listeners, and he met Georgiana's gaze with something that might have been concern or might have been satisfaction. She could not tell which, and found she no longer cared. The ride back to London passed in uncomfortable silence, Georgiana staring out the window while her mind spun in circles, weighing duty against desire, security against happiness, the safe path against the uncertain one. Sebastian sat across from her, his face carefully blank, and she wondered if he was already preparing himself for her rejection, already building back the walls that 3 weeks of dancing had begun to erode. When they arrived at her father's house, Sebastian helped her descend from the carriage with the same careful courtesy he had always shown, but he did not meet her eyes as he bowed formally and said, "I await your decision, Miss Fairfax," the return to her formal name feeling like a door closing between them. Georgiana stood on the steps and watched his carriage roll away, and then she turned and entered the house to find her father waiting in the entrance hall with an expression of confusion and concern. "My dear, what has happened?" Lord Fairfax asked. "Lady Pemberton sent a note saying there was some disturbance at the garden party." Georgiana looked at her father, this kind man who had tried his best after losing the love of his life and had made mistakes born of grief and desperation rather than malice, and she knew she could not explain without breaking down completely. "Later, Papa," she said quietly. "I need to think." She retreated to her room and dismissed her maid, and sat at her window staring out at the London rooftops while the sun slowly set and shadows lengthened across the city. Somewhere out there, Sebastian was probably in his study, alone with his brandy and his ghosts, assuming she would choose safety over him, because why would anyone choose differently? And somewhere out there, Edmund was celebrating his victory, convinced he had rescued her from ruin when in fact he had only revealed his own cruel nature. The choice before her was impossible, both paths leading to loss, one offering security and respectability at the cost of happiness, the other offering love and partnership at the cost of everything else. But as the stars began to emerge in the darkening sky, Georgiana found herself thinking about her mother, who had chosen to help others even knowing it might cost her life, who had always said that privilege carried responsibility, but also that life was too short to live by fear alone. She thought about the past 3 weeks, the way Sebastian had made her feel valued and seen, the conversations that had ranged from silly to profound, the way her heart had lifted every time his carriage arrived to collect her for another evening of dancing. And she thought about the rest of her life, decades stretching ahead, and tried to imagine living them without ever feeling that way again, without ever being truly seen by another person, trapped in a respectable marriage to a man who viewed her as property rather than partner. The choice was impossible, but as midnight approached and London settled into uneasy sleep around her, Georgiana realized that perhaps some choices were worth making, even when they cost everything, that perhaps her mother had been right about living without fear, and that she would rather face scandal with Sebastian than security with Edmund, would rather be ruined for loving the wrong man than respected for accepting the right one. She did not know yet how she would tell her father or how she would face society's judgment, or what would happen when the season ended and their arrangement expired, leaving her with no protection and no prospects. She knew only that tomorrow she would send word to Sebastian that she was staying, that she chose him despite everything, and that whatever consequences followed were hers to bear, chosen freely rather than accepted with resignation, and that somehow that made all the difference. The 2 days following the garden party disaster passed with agonizing slowness, each hour stretching into an eternity as Georgiana sat in her room and wrestled with the impossible decision before her, barely eating, hardly sleeping, her mind spinning through endless calculations of duty and desire, security and love, the safe path and the uncertain one. Lord Fairfax had tried repeatedly to speak with her, his face creased with worry as he hovered outside her door, asking if she was ill, if she needed anything, if perhaps she would like to discuss whatever had happened at the Marquis of Blackwood's garden party, but she had sent him away each time with gentle insistence that she needed solitude to think. The entire city seemed to be holding its breath waiting for her decision, and she knew from the notes that arrived hourly that society had already divided into camps, some convinced she would do the sensible thing and accept Edmund's renewed suit, which he had formally offered through her father the morning after the garden party, others speculating that the Duke of Ashford's scandal had destroyed any chance of a respectable match for her, and she would be forced to retire to the country in disgrace. Lady Caroline had called twice, full of concerned questions and offers of support, and even her aunt had written from the countryside urging her to think carefully about throwing away her future for a man whose past was so clouded with suspicion, well-meaning advice that only made Georgiana's chest ache with the weight of expectation and judgment. She had spent hours staring out her window at the London rooftops, watching the city carry on with its daily business while her entire world hung in balance. And she had thought about her mother more in those 2 days than she had in years, remembering the stories her father used to tell about the woman who had chosen principle over safety, who had believed that privilege carried responsibility, and that life was too precious to live in fear. On the afternoon of the second day, as shadows lengthened across her room and the sounds of evening began to drift up from the street below, Georgiana finally allowed herself to acknowledge the truth she had been circling since the moment Sebastian had offered to release her from their arrangement, which was that she loved him with a certainty that transcended logic or practicality, loved him for his honor and his vulnerability and the way he had given her choice when no one else had, and that she would rather face scandal and ruin with him than security and respectability with anyone else. The realization brought a strange calm, the clarity of a decision made despite its cost, and she rose from her window seat and went to her writing desk, where she composed 2 letters, one to Sebastian telling him that she had made her choice and asking him to meet her at the Royal Charity Ball the following evening, and one to her father explaining as gently as she could that she would not be accepting Edmund Whitmore's suit and that she understood if this disappointed him, but hoped he would eventually understand that she needed to choose her own path, even if it led somewhere unexpected. Lord Fairfax had received her letter with visible distress, his hands trembling as he read her words, and then he had looked at her with eyes that held both worry and something that might have been pride, as he asked if she was certain, truly certain, because once this choice was made, there would be no going back. She had nodded, her throat too tight for words, and he had embraced her with the fierce protectiveness of a father who wanted to shield his daughter from pain, but understood that some lessons could only be learned through living them. The letter to Sebastian she had sent by private messenger, with instructions that it be delivered directly into the Duke's hands, but the messenger had returned with word that the Duke of Ashford had left London 2 days prior for his estate in Kent, and was not expected to return for the remainder of the season, and Georgiana had felt her carefully constructed resolve waver at the realization that Sebastian had already given up, had already assumed she would choose safety over him, and had retreated to lick his wounds in private. But Lord Fairfax, when she had told him of Sebastian's departure with poorly concealed devastation, had surprised her by placing a gentle hand on her shoulder and saying that perhaps the Duke simply needed to be shown that someone was willing to fight for him the way he had fought for her, And then her father had done something that made Georgiana's eyes fill with tears, which was to take the letter she had written to Sebastian and promise to send it by the fastest rider he could hire, with instructions to deliver it to Kent and await a response. The Royal Charity Ball was the most prestigious event of the entire social season, held in the staterooms of Buckingham Palace with minor royalty in attendance and guest lists so exclusive that invitations were considered marks of the highest social standing, and Georgiana had never expected to attend until Sebastian's arrangement with her father had elevated her status enough to warrant inclusion. Now, as her carriage rolled through the palace gates on the evening of the third day, she felt terror and determination warring in her chest. Her hands trembled.